Prince in Clash Royale has been one of the most hated cards in 2025. It's a card Supercell historically has been very hesitant to do anything about, but although there has been a lot of hate for Prince recently, it's nothing new in the grand scheme of things. Prince has historically been one of the most hated cards in Clash Royale dating all the way back to nearly 10 years ago. It's received a whopping 15 balance changes since its release and had a lot of wild surges. I've wanted to make a video on this card for a long time, but I've delayed it time and time again because it's been so unpredictable and unstable. However, I feel now it's settled for a bit, so I think it's time. In this video, we'll be covering the entire history of the Prince, how it's contributed to various metas, cover all the balance changes it's received, and talk about why Supercell's been so hesitant on properly dealing with this card for so long. Prince was released as one of the OG 42 cards all the way back on January 4th, 2016. It was epic rarity, which was the highest at the time, making it a very special card. Prince would be very unique in the sense that it had two different movement speeds. When you placed it, it would begin moving at 1 tile per second, but after traveling 2.5 tiles, it would increase to 2.3 tiles per second, which was faster than any other troop could move in the game. Also, when it was charging, its first attack would come out instantly when it connected to a unit and deal double the damage of its normal attack. He also had the longest range of any melee unit at 1.85 tiles, so he'd always get a lot of time to attack in a one-on-one interaction against any melee unit. His total damage when charging was a little more than a fireball, so he could one-shot some medium health units like wizards and musketeers. If that wasn't enough, he even had enough health to survive any spell, and he was immune to knockback. He attacked fairly slowly though, so swarms like Skeleton Army would eat him up if there was nothing to support him. He was also a bit difficult to put into a push since he was so fast. The combination of being so fast that he outruns every troop and also not being good on his own and also being 5 elixir did not seem like the recipe for a healthy card. Prince was also very special in the sense that he was a starter epic. You see, back in these days when you completed the tutorial, you would get one epic card to start you on your Clash journey, and you would randomly get one of 4 options: Witch, Baby Dragon, Skeleton Army, and Prince. What you got would define you as a player early on. This is a card that would carry you far in the early arenas because a level 1 epic was equivalent to about a level 6 common or 4 rare, and of course when you were just starting, you wouldn't have your cards leveled up at all. This is where the first major problem of Prince lied. He was fairly easy to counter if you knew how to deal with him properly, but players just starting the game wouldn't know how to counter him, plus they'd be dealing with him when their cards were underleveled, so it wasn't exactly a warm welcome to the game. Prince to many new players was a nightmare. He was so fast and tanky and dealt so much damage that it felt like he had no weaknesses to many. Just one Prince charge took out about 1/4 of the Princess Tower, even more if it was overleveled, and it just felt so punishing. Because he was simple to play, difficult to counter, and lots of players hated him, Supercell decided to take quick action. On January 11th, 2016, just 1 week after the game's beta launch, in the very first set of balance changes, Prince would receive a nerf. It would be a small change, being a simple health decrease of 4%. Seth, a former community manager, referred to this change as a suggestive nerf, which is basically a change that's not really meant to have a real effect on a card. It's more of a message to the player saying, hey, we know you like this card, but maybe try something different. And it makes sense why they'd go light on the nerf despite the level of backlash it was getting. As players leveled up their cards, Prince would lose its advantage of being a starter epic. They weren't implementing these balance changes based on an equal competitive environment, but rather the early arenas meta. Everybody was a new player, and there wasn't a competitive scene yet, so there really wasn't anything else to balance off of. They didn't really feel like Prince needed a nerf right now, but because of backlash, they gave it one just to shut the players up. I mean, it still survived the same number of tower shots as it did before. We'd finally get some top ladder stats about a week after this change going live, and we can see that Prince had a 20% use rate, which is quite high by today's standards, but it's actually right around average for the time considering there were only 42 cards in the game. However, just because it was statistically balanced in the most competitive area of the game does not mean players stopped complaining about how strong they felt it was. Because if the Prince was balanced in a fair environment, you can imagine how horrible it was when he was 4 levels higher than all the other cards. This was more of a progression issue than an issue with the Prince specifically. Other epics had this problem too to some extent, but Prince was tanky and fast and dealt a lot of damage, which is what made him feel more oppressive compared to other epics. Once you started moving up and leveling your commons and rares, he didn't feel like so much of an issue. That frustrating interaction where he barely gets a final charge on the tower with 1 hit point left happened less often. By February, its usage in top ladder fell to just 8%. In this same snapshot, Tombstone was the most used card, so it's understandable why we were seeing less Prince. Tombstone spawned waves of skeletons, and it distracted the prince really well. Even when the building was destroyed, it left more skeletons behind, of which Prince could only take out one at a time. Remember, by this point the game had existed for barely a month. Players were quickly leveling up and learning how to play better. There likely would have been a trickle down even if the prince hadn't received that health nerf. A large chunk of players still found him really annoying though, and didn't think the nerf went far enough. Tombstone would get nerfed in 2 separate sets of balance changes in February though, and following these, Prince saw a major comeback in top ladder. But things wouldn't stop here. In March, Supercell would add a brand new prince, the Dark Prince. It was similar to the prince in a lot of ways, and you might think at first that adding a similar card to Prince would lead to it taking some of its usage away. But Supercell did a good job at making this card different enough so that wouldn't be an issue in this case. After the Dark Prince was added, Prince's use rate in top ladder nearly doubled. It wasn't a competitor, it was a synergizer. The main thing that made Dark Prince stand out from Prince is its splash damage, meaning it could hit multiple units at once. Only being able to hit one unit at a time was the Prince's main weakness. The Dark Prince dealt significantly less damage per hit though, so it could be blocked and countered by tankier units, which the Prince could easily take care of. So setting them in together made countering either one of them way more difficult. Prince wasn't really considered a win condition, but when Dark Prince came along, some players were using them together sort of as a win condition because with them it was easy to clear paths and just get your support troops on the tower. A very popular third card that was also common with this duo was the P.E.K.K.A. P.E.K.K.A. was a giant slow-moving unit that wasn't really a win condition either, but deadly when properly supported, and the princess did a good job at clearing the path for her. People were using Prince so much that it even started to replace the Hog Rider in some decks. I imagine the Dark Prince was invented to be an alternative to Prince, but it just ended up making it more of a nightmare. Because Prince was now being used in nearly half of top ladder decks, and was the most used card in the entire game overall, and was terrorizing the lower arenas, it was no doubt time for another nerf. Prince would appear in the balance changes on March 23, 2016. Its main problem was that it was too fast and hard to react to, so that's the problem they'd be tackling in this patch. They would end up changing its charging speed from 2.3 to 2 tiles, which meant it now matched the running speed of a Hog Rider. So that means if you placed a Hog Rider just right, the Prince would just keep running after it forever until it stopped. This was about a 14% decrease of speed, which would overall give you a good chunk of extra time to stop this card. I understand why they made this change, but bringing the charge down to me made the card feel less epic. Being faster than every other unit when charging is what made it feel so spectacular. Standardizing it to be in sync with other low rarity units takes away from that epicness. But at the time, players definitely appreciated the extra time they would have to deal with this monster. Following this change going live, Prince's usage dwindled down. It was still a very popular card, but the nerf had definitely taken a toll on it. Overall though, its usage in top ladder was much closer to the average card, so it would seem like the change was successful. But as time went on, we could see that Prince's usage in competitive play was a bit unstable. It was consistently maintaining above average usage in low and top ladder, but this wasn't proof that Prince was in a healthy state, as we would soon come to see. In a Helsinki tournament that took place in April that had some of the best Clash Royale players at the time competing, Prince did not make a single appearance. With how much it was terrorizing lower arenas and with how much P.E.K.K.A. Prince you were seeing at the top, it was astonishing to see nobody bothering with it in this major tournament. You'd think if people were using it in about a quarter of decks in top ladder, the most competitive area of the game, at least a few players would use it in this tournament. But this went back to the Prince's original problem: over-leveling. At max level, an epic card was 4 levels lower than a common, but in tournament play, it was 5 levels lower. It was inconsistent. This meant epics were much stronger in top ladder than in tournament play by comparison. This was pretty weird, so Supercell would take aim to fix this. They had 2 options: lower the epic level in tournament play, or add a new max level. And they chose the latter. On May 3rd, 2016, commons and rares would get an additional level, making them be 5 and 3 levels higher than epics in top ladder in tournament play. 1 level does make a world of difference, as we can see by comparing appearance rates, and this would undoubtedly have a major effect on Prince in top ladder. Just one major interaction difference to point out was that he would no longer be able to take out medium health units like Musketeer and Wizard with his charge. Within just a few weeks of this update, Prince's usage in top ladder tanked to far below what was considered healthy usage. This card had been overhyped for a while, and the reality was finally starting to set in. Prince was never truly that good. It just worked well because of a broken leveling system. Even in Supercell's little blurb they put when talking about the cards, they mentioned that he wasn't overpowered when looking at his win rate. However, even with this fall, a lot of players were still tearing their hair dealing with this beast. It didn't matter that he wasn't being used a lot in top ladder because they weren't playing in top ladder. He was essentially just a low to mid ladder menace, appearing like a strong, flashy card that appears everywhere and can't be stopped, but in reality, he's on the weaker side and pretty simple to counter if you know what you're doing. It left him in this awkward spot where he needed a buff to see more use in competitive play, but doing so would upset a large chunk of the player base and make the card more of a nightmare in certain areas of the game. Supercell though ultimately decided that Prince was in such a weak spot competitively and needed a buff, so they would give it one. This would come on June 21st. Its damage would be increased by 9%, so it essentially dealt the same damage as it did one level higher before, meaning it could one-shot musketeers, wizards, and barbarians with its charge again. The charge should feel powerful, and just didn't ever since they gave the other rarities that new level, making them all beefier. In their explanation, they acknowledged that Prince is a terror in the early arenas, but were buffing it anyway because its lack of presence higher up. Following this change going live, Prince's rates in top ladder would trickle up. It wasn't crazy popular, but P.E.K.K.A Double Prince was making a small comeback, and you also saw some giant players including it. The card seemed to be in an alright position. It was still hated by low-level players, but it was used a healthy amount in competitive play. Prince would get one more change in 2016 though, in August. In this set, his damage was increased by an additional 2%, and this was simply to fix an inconsistency. You see, before, a Prince charge would one-shot a Barbarian at every level except max level. This tiny bump would allow him to one-shot Barbarians at all levels. So even though 2% doesn't sound notable, this would make a huge difference in reality. Prince's use rate in top ladder continued to trickle up after this change going live. In addition to appearing in Goizen decks, which was the most popular deck at the time, it was also appearing a lot in minor cycle decks. It was trickling up more and more, until October where it was being seen in almost 1/3 of top ladder decks. It was seeming like the card was going to need another nerf, but there would be a shift this month. Goizen had been dominating the meta for months now, and it had done a big part in bringing Prince up. But in October, the combo would get nerfed. It was also around this time you were starting to see a Mega Minion surge, a very strong unit Prince couldn't attack because it was in the air. Following the October balance changes, Prince's usage in top ladder plummeted. Goizen was completely irrelevant now, and minor decks stopped including it. Also because of the poison nerf, previously dead cards like Skeleton Army and Tombstone were surging again, which made it a lot harder to get value out of Prince because they were so good against him. Things had completely flipped. It really showed how dependent this card was on other strong cards in the meta. From being borderline needing a nerf to one of the least used cards in such a short time frame was very unusual without receiving any direct changes, and it wasn't coming back anytime soon. For the rest of the year, Prince's use rate in top ladder rested between 0 and 1%. It was clearly not a good card by this point despite the damage buffs it got, only seeming good before because of the giant poison meta. Because the drop was so random and sudden though, it was good to let the card settle and see if it could adapt into future metas on its own. Although it seemed like Prince was going to make no appearances for a while, we would see some development in January 2017. Giant was getting popular again, and Prince was fitting right in with him. By the end of January, 16 of top ladder decks were including him, every single one of them being a giant beatdown deck. He clearly still had a lot of potential, but his place in the meta was very niche as he wasn't appearing in anything else. He certainly wasn't a mainstay, however, because by the end of February, he was back to making 0 appearances. He seemed very unstable, but for the majority of the year, Prince's use rate remained embarrassingly low. It had a few spikes, but ultimately the card was unseen in competitive play. Because it wasn't having any more major spikes, more and more people were believing this card needed a buff. But as we've discussed, mid to low ladder players hated Prince a lot in 2016. By this point, however, it was being perceived much more favorably. It wasn't seen as the monster it used to be seen as. There had been other card additions that got the focus off Prince, and the progression system had gotten better. At this point, Prince probably wouldn't be a problem for any player after just a few weeks of starting the game, which is likely the reason why they finally felt comfortable giving it a buff. On December 12, 2017, Prince would receive a buff for the first time in over a year. Its health was increased by 5%, and its hit speed was decreased by 1/10 of a second. These were just some standard stat buffs that wouldn't have any major interaction changes, but would certainly help overall. Following this set of changes, Prince's usage in competitive play had a small spike, but once again it was mainly being seen in giant decks. In these giant decks you were seeing Dark Prince as well, meaning the double Prince combo was back. You even saw P.E.K.K.A Double Prince make a mini resurgence. The changes actually seemed to be perfect. The rates of Prince were right about average. Was it still annoying sometimes? Of course, but in an era of Mega Knight, Elite Barbarians, Royal Giant, and Logbait, Prince was nowhere near the top of most people's concerns. The real problems wouldn't come until a few months later. In February of 2018, the Dark Prince would receive some major buffs, making these double Prince decks significantly more powerful. For the next 3 seasons, Giant Double Prince would top the leaderboards as the most popular deck in Top Ladder, and Prince's individual usage spiked. Not only was it appearing with Giant, but also with Golem. Even with a nerf to the Dark Prince in April, the combo stood strong. Princes were all over the place during this era. You even saw some people using Prince in logbait decks. Prince's use rate wasn't ridiculously high following the Dark Prince nerf in April, but it was getting tiring seeing these guys running around everywhere. Because of Giant Double Prince's consistent dominance over everything else, Supercell would take action once again. On June 20th, 2018, Supercell would tone down this combo by giving both Princes the exact same change. Their distance required to charge would be increased from 2.5 to 3.5 tiles. This meant that it essentially took an extra second for them to begin moving faster, giving a lot of extra reaction time to the defender. This set of changes also sought to make the charge up distance consistent with the battle ram to make this mechanic feel simplified and easier to understand. This was an interesting change because this stat had never been changed before and felt pretty set in stone up until this point. It just didn't quite feel right taking so much longer. The community was sure that Princes were going to be unusable after these changes, and they wouldn't be far off. Prince was not a big threat because of how long it took to charge now. Dark Prince was able to settle alright, but Prince being one more elixir made it less appealing. Just like that, an extra 1 second to charge up changed the Prince from a pretty strong card to practically useless. If that wasn't bad enough, shortly after this change going live, the Royal Recruits were added, a card that countered Prince stupidly well for just one more elixir since they were a swarm and had shields. With a lot of bait and swarm cards consistently dominating the meta and the log being able to knock back and reset them, it's no wonder why in combo with this nerf, Prince was practically a dead card in competitive play now. It had clearly gone too far, so a good middle ground may have been to partially walk back the last nerf. But since that had been standardized, that's not what they would do. On September 3rd, 2018, Prince's health would be increased by 5%. Supercell claims that for 5 elixir, Prince was a bit fragile compared to other melee attackers, so this health boost would make him more formidable in combat. Immediately following this buff, you saw a Golem Prince deck begin to trend for a bit, and you were also seeing it back in Giant and Logbait again. For the remainder of 2018, it was maintaining average rates, appearing in a nice variety of decks, adapting nicely with the ever-changing landscape. You even saw it popping up with Mortar a bit. Prince wouldn't need any more adjustments or changes. It seemed like they finally got it in a functional, stable place, and they could just focus on other cards. But of course, Supercell is Supercell, so when they see something maintaining stability and balance, they have to come along and fix it. Prince was hot in early 2019. In the first half of the year, you were not only seeing it in Mortar and Giant decks, but this variant of Rascal Logbait was pretty popular too. By April, you were seeing it in Bridge Spam, Minor Cycle decks, and a little later it was even replacing Night Witch and Golem Beatdown. Its use rate was creeping up, and it was seeming like it was a little on the strong side. But these were just normal brief fluctuations, and not an indication that it needed a nerf. However, in July 2019, he would receive a nerf anyway. You see, in July 2019, they were standardizing the ranges of melee cards. Before, the ranges of melee cards were all over the place, but now they would be placed in one of 3 categories. Prince had the longest range of any melee unit at the game at 1.85 tiles, but now the maximum range a melee card could have after this update is 1.6 tiles, so his range was decreased by a quarter tile to fit into this new category. It doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a pretty significant decrease considering this is range we're talking about. A quarter tile decrease means he connects to his target a quarter second later if he's not charging. Cards going against him would get more time to attack him in one-on-ones, making a big difference in tight battles. And once again, like with decreasing his charging speed, decreasing his range so that he'd no longer uniquely have the longest range of any melee card made him feel less epic to me. Prince was a cool card originally because he was the fastest and had the longest melee range, but now he was the same as other cards, making his high rarity feel less deserved. Looking at his performance in the next few months, you can see a gradual decline. Him not having that extra long lance attack allowed units to get much closer to him much quicker. It's not like he was unviable, just a bit more niche. In the last few months of the year, the game became favorable to cards that could support Elixir Golem and Splash units, so single target high damage dealers like Prince just weren't as useful. It ended the year having below average rates. Before the addition of Elixir Golem in the meta that spurred, however, he at least had viable rates, so there was no need to buff him again right now. Once things settled down, Prince's rates would likely return closer to normal. You could argue that Prince having slightly below average rates would be better for the game overall considering the nuisance he was. I mean, before the range decrease, he had well above average rates. Considering how obnoxious he could be, that might not be healthy for the game. After the January balance changes that brought the meta back to a sense of normalcy, Prince's rates did seem to return closer to a healthy range, but this didn't last long as they quickly fell once again by February. For the next few months, its use rate remains between 2 and 3% in grand challenges with a win rate in the low 40s, which is pretty bad. However, it maintained a place in this logbait deck as well as Giant Double Prince, so it's not like it wasn't taking part in some competitively viable decks. It was a reasonable position to be in, even if it wasn't perfect. However, in June 2020, seemingly out of nowhere, Prince would be buffed. Coincidentally, this was also the season themed all around the Prince's dream. Which is why in their explanation for this change, they put, "Getting knocked out for Prince's dream has made the Prince just a bit tougher." Even though Prince's poor performance justified a buff, many players felt that this buff was a bit random, or done simply so that this card would be seen for the season themed around him, not so much that he actually needed one. Especially during a time where only 4 to 5 cards were getting balance changes per month, it felt weird to give the Prince a buff when there were so many other cards that had worse rates that felt like they were more deserving. All the buff would be is a health increase of 3%. A 3% health buff is very small and there wouldn't really be any major interaction changes from this, but overnight its usage spiked from 3 to 22% in grand challenges, indicating that it was way too strong. In addition to Rascalbait and Giant Double Prince, it was appearing in Bridge Spam, Royal Giant, Miner, and Mortar again. It truly was the Prince's dream. His usage would trickle down throughout the month after this initial spike, however, and by July they had actually settled to be about average, and by August they were back to being below average, as if that 3% health increase never happened. Looking back, it feels like this was a suggestive balance change to get people to use the Prince during the Prince season. The rates were consistently slightly better than before the 3% health buff though, so you can see the impact. Even if the rates were slightly below average though, most people saw the Prince as a balanced card and not in need of any further attention. And that's pretty much how things would remain for the remainder of 2020. Giant Double Prince and Rascalbait saw consistent use, but occasionally you might see Prince popping up in something new based on buffs to other cards. It ended the year having almost average rates, certainly much better than it was at the beginning of the year. Going into 2021, bait decks were still really popular, so you were still often seeing Rascalbait with Prince, and you were also seeing the rise of a Graveyard Double Prince deck. You had seen Double Prince paired with almost every tank before, and that made sense since they were good at clearing paths, but you didn't need to clear a path for a spell that could be placed anywhere in the arena. However, the Zappies and Hunter were really strong defensive cards at the time that allowed you to build pushes with the Princes and Graveyard on offense, and trying to stop both the Prince and Graveyard would be obnoxious for the defender. The Double Prince synergy was truly unmatched. The meta was shifting to be more favorable to Prince, which is how it actually had almost perfectly average rates in February and March. There was even a popular Electro Giant deck using it around this time. This is perhaps the healthiest state it was in ever. But later on in the year, the meta was calling for more splash units due to the rise of swarmy cards like Mother Witch and Goblin Drill, so some decks that were running Prince were subbing him out for Dark Prince. Also, the Fire Spirits were reworked into a 1 elixir counter to Goblin Barrel in June, and didn't get fixed until September, so in the summer of 2021, you weren't really seeing any logbait either. All of this took a toll on Prince, but regardless of the shifting meta, it had a place. Giant Double Prince was pretty much the only thing you saw Prince in for this period, as it was a good Dark Prince deck, and he was good right now, and the pair still had great synergy. There was also a progression change I wanted to mention that happened in 2021. You see, in June, they reorganized what arenas you unlock some cards in, and Prince was one of them. Prince being a card you unlock right away just didn't make sense because of how complex he was. He was tough to counter for new players, and his mechanic was hard to understand compared to other training camp cards, so he was moved from being unlockable in training camp to Arena 7. But this actually didn't really solve the problem of Prince running rampant in the early arenas. You see, beyond this update, no epic card was unlockable in training camp. Starter epics were no longer a thing because of the leveling issues. But the thing is that every Sunday you would be able to claim free epic cards in the shop regardless of what arena you were in. And for whatever reason, if you were in Arena 1, the epic you would get would always be a Prince, despite being 6 arenas lower than you were supposed to get him at. And once you unlocked him, you could use magic items and trade tokens on him, as well as request him from your clan on Sundays. This is why the problem of Prince ruling the lower arenas didn't go away. Why Prince was the default epic you would get is beyond me. Like, why not Skeleton Army? That was an epic unlockable in Arena 2, much easier to understand while also less frustrating to go against. Later, it was even changed so that if you were in Arena 5 or lower, you would always get a Prince on Epic Sunday, and that's still how it is in the game today. Prince wouldn't just be one of the epics you unlock early on to triumph over all the other cards, it was the only one now. If you were in Arena 1, it was smart to wait until Sunday to get the Prince before pushing to Arena 2 so you can unlock this beast. But of course, most players, especially new ones, didn't know this. So you saw lots of players complaining, wondering why they were going against so many Princes when he supposedly wasn't available until much later. It was tough if you didn't know this because you might push through Arena 1 in a day or two and completely miss your chance to claim him early on. If you missed your chance, you'd have to wait until Arena 7. Supercell sort of just made everything worse for new players while trying to make it better. They may as well have left Prince unlockable in training camp just so the people who didn't know about Epic Sunday early on weren't at a disadvantage. Back to Prince's place in the competitive scene though, it was a pretty standard year for the card overall. Once the Fire Spirit was fixed in September, Prince's rates returned closer to a healthy range, but it was still primarily only being seen in Giant Double Prince. However, Logbait with Prince became much more popular after a Rascal buff in December, leading to Prince ending off the year with slightly above average rates. Going into 2022, Prince was looking perfectly balanced once again. Things were a bit shaky after the range adjustment, but the health increase brought it back in line. But Supercell was still Supercell at the end of the day, so when they saw that Prince was balanced, they just had to do something about it. On February 3rd, 2022, Prince would receive a rework. But why? Why did this card with statistically balanced rates need any changes? Well, let's go over what the rework was first and what the developers said about it. First, its health was decreased by 4%, so it had slightly less health than it did before the June 2020 buff. But it was given the ability to hop over the river just like the Hog Rider. In their explanation, they state, "Hogs can jump, Rams can jump, why not the ponies?" With this change, we hope to bring more interesting interactions with the river and more strategic choices during the battle. Since this buff might make Princes a bit too strong, we are compensating the change by tuning down their hit points. Now I understand where they're coming from with this logic, but I always thought the reason Princes didn't hop was because they were wearing heavy suits of armor and carrying big weapons, which weighed them down. Many other players seemed to feel the same way. The Princes being able to jump the river just didn't feel right, and it just felt like an unnecessary rework overall. Like I said, Prince was statistically balanced. It didn't need this rework to find a place in the meta. It feels like they implemented this simply to shake things up and nothing else, which is not what balance changes are supposed to do in my opinion. Although a lot of people thought this rework was weird, they were excited about it, thinking Prince would dominate thanks to this change. Prince being able to jump the river allowed it to get to things placed in the middle of the base much quicker. Things placed right across the river could be reached much easier too. It would certainly help in plenty of scenarios and slightly change how he would be played, but nerfing its health was certainly gonna hurt. There was a lot of hype towards this change, but that quickly died down as it was proving to not provide as much value as expected. The rates quickly tanked, showing that Prince wasn't really competitively viable anymore. By March, there weren't any Prince decks on the top deck list. It certainly didn't help that the meta was very swarm heavy again, pioneered by the rise of Skeleton King. Supercell had ruined a perfectly balanced card, and there was no telling what the next move would be. For the next few months, Supercell would let the card rot. It had a pretty awful few months, making it seem like the health reduction to compensate for that jumping ability was unnecessary. Being able to jump the river was a niche ability. In a lot of scenarios, it wouldn't even matter. But in almost every scenario, having less health mattered. The card seemed fine before the February 2022 rework, but they wouldn't be reverting the jump mechanic. However, in August 2022, they would give it some direct attention in the balance changes. On August 2nd, they would decrease the distance required to charge from 3.5 to 3 tiles, meeting in the middle of its original and current charge-up distance. Supercell acknowledged Prince had been struggling recently, so they gave extra carrots to his pony, allowing him to enter his charging state quicker. One thing that made Prince feel so weak was that it felt like an eternity before it entered its charging state. 3.5 tiles never felt quite right, so if they weren't going to revert the health nerf, I'm glad they went this route. Prince didn't seem to return quite to where it was before the February rework, but it appeared to be in a healthy spot nevertheless. You were seeing some new variants of Giant Double Prince rising, as well as Prince with Mega Knight quite a bit now. Prince was a tad underused, but maintained a good win rate and had a place in a few different moderately popular decks, so it could have been worse. Towards the end of the year, however, the meta was warped with the addition of Phoenix and Monk, and following this, the demand for Prince tanked once again, leading to its rates becoming underwhelming. You just weren't seeing it a lot towards the end of the year because of the awful environment. 2023 was looking to be an average year for Prince, but this was the year that introduced evolutions, so that's not exactly how things would go. As Phoenix was toned down further in early 2023, the use rate of Prince trickled back up. Rascals received another buff in April, and following that you saw Rascal Logbait with Prince seeing some use again. From here though, the rates would trickle down. In May, you were seeing a lot of Skeleton King, Goblin Hut, Graveyard, things Prince just wasn't great against. And things only got worse following the release of Evolutions in June. In the next few months, you would see the rise of a lot of Evos that performed especially well against Prince. You had the evolved Skeletons that could fully counter Prince for 1 elixir, evolved Barbarians that survived a Prince charge, the evolved Royal Recruits which charged similar to the Prince and made them more prevalent when they already countered Prince very well. None of the evolutions that were added really benefited Prince. They only made it harder for him to get around. Because of this dwindling performance, Supercell actually proposed a Prince buff in the October 2023 balance changes that would decrease his charge-up distance even further down to 2.5 tiles. However, for this set of changes, Supercell would be holding a vote, and only the 10 most voted balance changes out of 23 would get implemented. And not only did Prince not get into the top 10, but it got the least amount of votes out of all the proposed changes, showing there wasn't a high demand for a Prince buff, meaning the card would remain as is. It maintained about a 2% use rate with a win rate in the 30s to low 40s. Things weren't looking much better come 2024. You were seeing a Mega Knight deck with Evolutions and Prince doing pretty well in March, and Giant was pretty popular around this time, so you were seeing some decks with him and Prince performing decently in April, but these little spikes weren't lasting long, and even when Prince did have these spikes, they weren't huge. By May, its rates were hitting record lows. You had the evolved Zap flooding the meta, which could reset the Prince's charge 3 times for 2 elixir, as well as the evolved Tesla, which sent out a pulse, also resetting the Prince's charge, making it very hard to connect. These were some of the most popular evolutions, so it's no surprise we weren't seeing a lot of Prince going around. So, for the first time in nearly 2 years, Prince would appear in the balance changes. It needed a further adjustment to compete in this evolution-filled meta, especially if it wasn't going to be getting an evolution of its own anytime soon. On June 17, 2024, its distance required to charge was reduced even further, from 3 to 1.5 tiles. This was a drastic reduction. They must have fed that pony a lot of carrots. It made it far less than it was even back in 2016. It would begin charging in literally half the time it used to. Increasing this by 1 tile was a drastic nerf that required a follow-up buff years ago, and you have to remember Prince was seen in a few top decks briefly just a few months prior. Reducing the charge-up distance by half a tile I would have understood, but 1.5 just seemed like so much, especially because of the interactions that changed from this. A lot of stun cards that reset Prince had hit speeds longer than 1.5 seconds, so when these cards attacked him now, he would get little charge bursts in between each attack, allowing him to move significantly faster than before when caught in a repeated stun. 1.5 seconds was not a lot of time. Prince would get charge connections much more consistently now. It's like they wanted to buff Prince, a non-evolved card, to be on par with overpowered evolutions. I mean, they may have chosen this number to match evolved Royal Recruit's charge-up distance. Looking at his rates a couple days after release, they seemed to have barely risen, but this actually had nothing to do with Prince. On the same day of this Prince buff, Supercell added some very broken cards to the game, so the meta at this point was just cycling to these overpowered cards as fast as possible, something a 5 elixir card like Prince would not help with. But after some emergency nerfs 2 days later, Prince had a major surge in popularity. It was being used in over a quarter of Grand Challenge decks. You had your Giant decks, your Rascal Bait decks, and one I found to be very interesting, this P.E.K.K.A. Spam deck that contained 3 charging cards. Supercell had clearly gone way too far with the buff. Prince was more annoying than ever. The balance was easily the worst it's ever been, and that's crazy considering how long it's been out and how many balance changes it's received over the years. It's like the balancing team didn't know what they were doing anymore. It was charging all over the place now and constantly getting connections when it felt like it shouldn't. Before, if a Prince was placed right at the bridge, you could place something right when it crossed the bridge and it wouldn't get its charge out in time, but that wasn't possible anymore. By the time it crossed the bridge, it was already charging. And if it had just a couple of hit points left, it would very likely squeeze out a last second charge and hit the tower. You had to be so much more careful and diligent when dealing with this monster, it was absolutely ridiculous. Funny enough, you weren't really seeing any double Prince because the Dark Prince's charge-up distance remained unchanged since that 2018 nerf, which felt really wrong to many players. There was no doubt Prince needed a nerf, so just 15 days after this buff, it would appear in the balance changes once again. On July 2nd, 2024, they would partially walk back the June buff, increasing the distance required to charge from 1.5 to 2 tiles. It still charged up a lot quicker than before June, but it wasn't constantly charging its way out of repeated stuns, which I think was the main issue. Looking at its performance, we can see it was much healthier. 3 tiles was definitely too much, and 1.5 tiles wasn't enough. However, some players were claiming that even with a 2-tile charge-up distance, Prince was too strong. You were seeing some new variants of decks Prince had been present in for years now rising up, but one I really wanted to highlight was this Goblin Giant Double Prince deck that rose in August, and was very popular for a few months. Dark Prince had been slugging behind since it hadn't received a charge-up distance buff like the standard Prince, so it was interesting to see a deck with him and Prince rising to such prominence. This style of deck where princes clear the path for a tank hadn't been seen much recently, but with the Prince being faster, 3 spells, and the Goblin Giant's new ability to spawn units, it was an excellent adaptation into this new era of Clash Royale. With the rise of Evolved Electro Dragon and Goblinstein in October though, the demand for Prince fell once again. For the rest of 2024, we didn't see a lot of Prince. It went back to having subpar rates, not really having a place with all these resetters in the meta. Ram Rider was similar to Prince in a lot of ways, and just synergized much better with the meta drivers at the time. The 2-tile charge-up distance wasn't seeming good enough, but we would see some more development in early 2025. Specifically, in February, we saw a major spike in Prince's use and win rate. With major nerfs to Goblinstein, Goblin Giant, and P.E.K.K.A., Prince had more room to thrive. This Mega Knight deck was picking up steam in February, and you were seeing more double Prince again since Dark Prince had been recently buffed. With an above average use rate and really high win rate, it was seeming like Prince was potentially too strong. When the March balance changes came along, there were some people questioning why Prince wasn't receiving a nerf. As I mentioned before, Ram Rider was in a similar position to Prince. They had been receiving a lot of the same changes, and Ram had received a health nerf for being too strong, so many thought Prince should have received a similar nerf. It was feeling really oppressive, and although it may have not needed a nerf right now, it was definitely on a lot of people's radars. Although, not nerfing it may have been a major mistake. Not pulling back the reins on Prince now allowed him to run rampant. In addition to what he was already appearing in, Prince had a prominent place in this Giant Evolved Lumberjack deck that blew up to extreme levels of popularity this month. Thanks to the support of this deck, Prince rose to being in almost a quarter of Grand Challenge decks, making it the second most used troop in Grand Challenges and the most used troop that did not have an evolution. It seemed more than obvious now that Prince needed a nerf, but to the community's surprise, Prince would be absent from the April balance changes. Despite it maintaining extremely high usage and a very high win rate throughout the season, Supercell ultimately decided to not nerf it at all. The community was outraged, and under any talk about the balance changes, one question was asked more than any other. Where was Prince? How can a card be so overused in competitive play and not receive a nerf? Supercell releases a work-in-progress set of balance changes before posting the finalized official versions nowadays, which allows them to gather feedback from the community, and despite almost every comment asking for a Prince nerf, they wouldn't budge. There was so much anger and confusion towards the absence of Prince that Supercell themselves put out a statement explaining why they wouldn't be nerfing it in April despite drastically high rates. They state, "From our perspective, Prince's usage rates have only become problematic since Evo Lumberjack's release, specifically in Giant Prince. This also coincided with a significant increase in Dagger Duchess usage rate. We view Giant Prince as being too strong, but separately, we view Evo Lumberjack, Dagger Duchess, and Rage as also being too strong, regardless of Giant Prince. The goal of a Prince nerf would be to specifically balance Giant Prince, but since that deck is already receiving 3 nerfs, we feel it would be over-nerfing the deck. Before February, there was little feedback about Prince, and the stats did not suggest he was too strong. If Giant Prince, or Prince in general, maintains similar usage rates this season, we will nerf it." Prince had been too popular mainly because of this one specific deck. With Evolved Lumberjack, Rage, and Dagger Duchess getting nerfed, the deck would obviously be much weaker, leading to Prince's rates falling as well, so I don't blame the balancing team for holding off. However, the Retro Royale game mode was also going on this month, and despite there being no Evolved Lumberjack and Dagger Duchess in this mode, many felt he was still too strong. However, I still think waiting was the correct move. Sometimes in the past, when a card rises for a month or two, Supercell overreacts with a harsh nerf and ends up killing it. Prince had subpar rates just a few months prior. It likely was just carried heavily by Evolved Lumberjack. Plus, one thing Supercell did not mention was the addition of a new card, the Boss Bandit, also coming in April. Boss Bandit was similar to Bandit, and this card would not be good for Prince because of its mechanic. You see, these Bandit cards had a dashing ability, and this dashing ability would cancel out the Prince's charge. Boss Bandit took it a step further because it could teleport and reinitiate its dash. This champion would be very popular in April, completely changing the types of decks that were popular from the previous season. After a few weeks, Prince's usage in Grand Challenges settled to be right about average. It seemed like the team had made the right call by not nerfing it in April. Since the rates had settled down, Supercell opted to not nerf Prince again in the May balance changes. However, for many players, this was not satisfactory. Prince was still a nightmare to deal with and way too strong in certain areas. Once again, under any post about the balance changes, you had people wondering why Prince wasn't included and that it needed a nerf badly. And not only was Prince absent, but they were nerfing Guards, one of Prince's best counters that was so highly used partially because of Prince. The Guards nerf was controversial because people were claiming they were nerfing the solution to a problem instead of the problem itself. What's funny is that Guards had a sudden rise just this month thanks to the rise of Boss Bandit, just like Prince did back when the Evolved Lumberjack was meta, and they didn't even see as much usage as Prince did when at its peak a month ago, yet Supercell was quick to nerf them. Even though Prince wasn't having the best performance this season, which could justify not nerfing it, Boss Bandit and Guards were all over the place, so many believed when these cards were properly toned down, Prince would explode again. But in May, Supercell would release the Witch evolution. Witch being back in the meta was rough for Prince because she spawned an endless stream of skeletons as long as she was alive. People were saying Prince was only bad because it was in a one-of-a-kind environment that was disfavorable to it and it was only temporary, but with all these new developments, it was seeming like there was always going to be something that was going to keep Prince down in the meta. That's why I think when the June balance changes came along and Prince wasn't present yet again, there weren't as many comments asking for a Prince nerf. It felt like those begging for one were just doing it out of habit at this point. Some top players were still saying Prince needed a nerf because unless you had a swarm, he could be really tough to consistently counter with his fast charge. But despite how the meta was changing, Prince's use rate was below average for the next few months, making a nerf seem unjustified. There were a core group of Prince haters that were unsatisfied with this and weren't going to be until it got a direct nerf, but that's normal for the Clash Royale community. We would see some more Prince development in August following the introduction of the Evolved Furnace. Evolved Furnace revitalized the meta, and Prince was decent against it because the Fire Spirits didn't reset its charge. Evolved Goblin Giant and Goblin Machine were also very prevalent around this time, and even though it didn't seem like it, all of these cards worked together in sort of a conglomerate of toxicity. This deck was extremely prevalent in August, and it was just a prime example as to why people believed Prince was too strong. Should a deck like this be competitively viable? And you also saw it a lot in September with Vines instead of Goblin Curse. It had a pretty major spike in usage thanks to its presence in this deck, but like with the Evolved Lumberjack situation, Supercell decided to tackle other cards in this deck instead of going after the Prince directly. Nerfing the cards associated with Prince seems to be the correct answer yet again, as following these nerfs, Prince's rates fell back to below average. Despite all the criticism it was getting, it seems to be in a fine spot. It hadn't received a change in well over a year by this point, and its spikes were brief and really only slightly above average. Nerfing this card would have been a nitpick. The demand for a Prince nerf had not disappeared, but was dwindling. However, this demand would seemingly come back in October following the balance change announcements for this month. You see, the October balance changes would bring forth the biggest set of balance changes in Clash Royale history, nerfing 31 different cards. The meta had just been awful, so Supercell was giving it a complete overhaul, nerfing not just overused cards, but also some average ones. Cards like Evolved Barbarians, Tombstone, and Bomber would be receiving nerfs despite having mediocre to subpar rates in competitive play. It was fine though, because the general power level of the average card was going down drastically. Since many players felt like Prince needed a nerf for about 8 months now, many were disappointed and upset that he wasn't included here. Once again, there was a massive uproar at the absence of Prince in this set of balance changes, despite him only appearing in 6 of the top 100 finishing ladder decks for the September season. You have to remember that even if he was seen an average amount in competitive play, he was a nuisance in mid-ladder. Many players were just so tired of seeing him. Now, technically, he was getting a small adjustment, but it was just a bug fix. As I stated at the beginning of this video, when Prince was charging, he had an instant first hit attack time, but if he was walking normally, it would take half a second to come out. But there was an issue where if he was charging and got reset, his first hit would come out instantly even if he hadn't built up his charge again. This bug had been in the game since 2016, over 9 years ago by this point, so it feels a bit random that it wasn't patched until right now. It was technically a nerf, but many weren't satisfied by this. It felt like Supercell just really didn't want to nerf Prince, and so they decided to fix some old bug to be able to say they did something to shut people up. But obviously that didn't work. The community was fed up with Prince getting away with no nerfs, and I think Supercell was just tired of people complaining about it because they would end up giving Prince a last-second nerf before the changes went live. This time, Supercell would actually listen to the community. On October 6th, 2025, Prince's distance required to charge would be increased from 2 to 2.5 tiles. This was the 5th time this stat had been changed, and it finally came full circle. The distance required to charge was back to what it was the very first day Prince was in the game. The charge-up distance most long-term players were used to and what they believed felt right for many years. In recent years, it didn't seem clear what distance the stat would be best at. It had been at every half increment from 1.5 to 3.5, and nowadays it seems like this is the only stat Supercell is interested in changing for Prince. None of Prince's other stats have been changed since February of 2022, besides a rounding error fix I didn't mention. I think the biggest problem was that Supercell went way too far with the Prince buff back in June of 2024. They should have just decreased the distance to 2.5 tiles and waited to see if it needed any further help. Moderation is key. The community was elated at this news. It felt like a war had been won. Besides getting the season shot back, I think a Prince nerf was the community's biggest wish for 2025. This is the last balance change Prince has received to date, so how is it doing nowadays? Its use rate fell a bit, which wasn't great because it already had a below average use rate, but it's certainly not useless. It ended the November season appearing in only 2 of the top 100 finishing ladder decks, indicating it needs a buff, but I think Supercell kind of knew this would be the result, which is why they held off on nerfing it. So is that really the end of Prince's story? Just suffering now because it can be annoying? Personally, I don't think we're going to see another rise of Prince unless it gets direct attention, and I don't think Supercell is going to bother buffing Prince again unless it suffers even further just because of how sensitive a lot of people get over his presence. But I think there will be more chapters to Prince's story in the coming years, as we haven't even gotten a Prince evolution yet. I'm very interested to see what a Prince evolution will look like. I suggested a new type of Prince in an older video where his charge wouldn't be interrupted when hitting units he could one-shot, allowing him to take out small units much quicker, but that could also work very well as Prince's evolution. Or they could make his ability similar to how it is in Merge Tactics, where he launches and stuns units when he charges into them. Perhaps he'd start charging normally at 2.5 tiles, but he'd get a special charge at 3.5 or 4 tiles that would grant him these extra abilities. There's a lot of potential here. I hope Supercell takes advantage of Prince's unique attributes instead of just giving it some lame healing ability or something. Also, in the process of me working on this video, Supercell announced the new Heroes feature, which gives pre-existing cards even more new abilities. So, on top of receiving an evolution, we'll likely see Prince receive a hero variation, which probably sends shivers down plenty of players' spines just thinking about. But anyway, what do you think about the Prince? Do you think it deserved the last nerf it got, or did Supercell go too far? Also, let me know which card's history you would like to see next. Thank you all for listening, and I'll catch you later.